One night you're awakened by the dreaded call in the middle of the night, and it develops your sister has been in a major automobile accident and is fighting for her life. You go to the hospital and you're told that it's going to be nip and tuck by the doctors, and they say that we should amputate one of her arms, and that would improve her chances for a recovery. But you remember once talking to her, and she was saying, well, I would rather die than have an amputation. The doctors look at you and say, what should we do? Do we have your consent for the amputation? All of us at some point will be making decisions for people who can't make their own decisions. Someone, for example, who's in the hospital who is unconscious, or maybe an aged parent who is no longer mentally competent to make their own decisions. How do you go about making those decisions, and what dangers do you face? Those are the two questions I'm going to look at. First, you might ask yourself to make that decision, what would I do if I were in that situation? Now, in modern education, there are no longer wrong answers, and presumably there are no longer wrong questions. However, if there were, that question, what would I do, would be a wrong question. You aren't making the decision for you, you're making it for them. So how would you approach it? Two questions you would ask that are good questions. One is, what is the best interest of the person that I'm deciding for? And second of all, what would they decide if they were conscious or if they were competent? Now, if those two come out the same way, then you're fine. You go with that. The problem, of course, arises when there may be a conflict between their best interests and what they decide, what they might decide. Think back when your children were small, taking your daughter to the dentist when she's 5. That's in her best interest. She doesn't want to go. Well, best interest there trumps what she wants to do. Now, when you become an adult, however, the balance changes. Because one of the things about being an adult is that we have the right to make our own decisions even if they are not in our own best interest. And if you're like me, and all the people I know, you've surely made a lot of those yourself. Now, one of the ways, how do you know what they would choose? One of the ways to get to that is to have conversations with people. So you can get a feel for what they would really like you to do under those circumstances. And indeed, you can ask them explicitly, if I ever have to make a decision for you when you are unconscious or unable to make one yourself, should I go with what I think to be your best interest, or should I go with what I think you would decide under the circumstances? What are the dangers that you will face when you are deciding for others? The first is very practical and very important. If you are managing money for someone else, say a parent, another relative who might be disabled, never once commingle funds. Never put a little money in your account with obviously the intent to pay it back, because oftentimes you'll never be able to pay it back. Also, you keep records of your expenditures. If you do commingle money, and if you don't keep records, you might not only be sued, but you may be arrested for fraud. So it's very, very serious. The second problem you're going to face as making decisions for other people is that oftentimes you will have, as they say, a dog in the fight. You will have a conflict of interest. A famous one is in Man from La Mancha, where Don Quixote is out fighting windmills and going through all the money, and his niece decides to protect herself and her own interest to have him basically locked up. And she sings at one point, and I'll just read that to you. She sings this great little lyric, "In my body it's well known, there is no one selfish bone. I'm only thinking and worrying about him." And of course we laugh about that when we hear that, because we know that that's not true. But you're going to get in that situation when you're managing people's money. For example, your parents might be in a nursing home. Should you spend top dollar on that? Or should you try to think about maybe preserving part of the estate so it will go to your children so they can go to college? Now, it's not always spend all the top dollar on your parents. because most grandparents would, if they were making the decision, try to save some money for their grandkids to go to college. Now, it's not as easy as it is in Man from La Mancha, where you are clearly taking advantage of someone. The truth of the matter is that once you have an interest, it corrupts your judgment more than your heart. So a lot of bad calls that you might make that will favor you or your family at the expense of someone else, you won't be consciously aware of the fact that you're doing something improper. Your judgment is, well, this seems like a good thing to do. One question you might want to ask yourself in making the decision: is my interest in this decision trumping my good judgment? And that will help you make better decisions. Now, of course, the philosophers have come in on this. Immanuel Kant said the way to make good decisions is to universalize the decision. Would you have everyone in your position make the same decision? And the idea there is that's going to factor out self-interest. Personally, I read about that as an undergraduate, but I've never tried to do that myself. But a good way, I think, another approach is to think of somebody that you admire and ask yourself, how would they decide it? And they won't have the same self-interest that you do. That will factor it out. How would so-and-so decide the matter? And of course, you've got to be honest with yourself and realize that in your body there is at least one selfish bone.